There we go. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Well, hello everyone. We are outside once again today. It is 90 degrees outside, so we had to do a little bit of moving around before we could find a spot that was out of the direct sunlight and also out of the wind. I don't mind wind in the background, but didn't want it whooshing over the microphone, drowning out everything. Today we are going to be talking about a book that I've known about for years, and there's a very compelling argument to be made that it is the most controversial fantasy novel ever written, and that is Lord Foul's Bane by Stephen R. Donaldson. This is book one in his series, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. This was first written as the first part of a trilogy, but Donaldson has since expanded it into a 10-book series. Just as a brief note of housekeeping, I'm reading this as part of a read-along of at least the first trilogy with Jake from Nerd Level Rising and also Zachary Shea. So some good friends here on BookTube. This was not on my immediate-to-read plans coming up this year, but when the opportunity arose, I jumped at it. I had a very interesting experience with this book. This book is kind of like the movie Psycho in a lot of ways. So if any of you have seen the Alfred Hitchcock film, the movie Psycho is famous for one scene, which is our main heroine at the beginning of the movie, spoilers for an almost 100-year-old movie, but is staying at this sort of seedy small hotel, and she goes to take a shower, and while she's showering, somebody appears, pulls back the shower curtain, and stabs her to death with a knife. So the shower scene from Psycho is famous. Even if you've never seen the movie Psycho, you know the shower scene. If you know anything about movies, you know this scene. You've at least seen it parodied or referenced. It is incredibly famous, and so much so that when you go into the movie Psycho, it is very hard to go into it and not know anything about it, and not know that that's coming up, and to be waiting for when that's going to happen. And it's hard to see past the forest for the trees. With a situation like that. And there's a similar situation with Lord Foul's Bane. I'll get this out of the way right off the bat here. I'm not planning on spoiling anything too significant about this book. But there will be some things that, if you want to know nothing but the back cover of the book, then go read the back cover of the book and come back when you've read it. But we'll be talking about some parts of this book and what makes it interesting and some of the things that Donaldson does here. But I'm not going to go out of my way to spoil specific plot points, if that makes sense. So we'll be keeping it general here, but it's not going to be completely free of that. So what Lord Foul's Bane is famous for is, during the course of this novel, there is an assault scene where one of the main characters sexually assaults another character. And at the time that this was written, I'm sure that was shocking and woke up a lot of people and was not what they were looking for in a fantasy novel. Which is funny because reading it as a modern day reader, if you've read George Martin, if you've read Joe Abercrombie, Mark Lawrence, if you've read really any modern adult fantasy author who deals with mature adult things in their books, the way Donaldson writes it is almost blink and you miss it. He's not cheap about it, he's not voyeuristic, but with how much of a reputation this scene has, it, to me at least, was surprising for just how understated it was in how he presented everything. And we'll get into dissecting that a little bit more, but I want to get that out of the way right off the bat, is that Donaldson is very mature in the language that he uses. He's not graphic, he's not victimizing the fictional victim as well in how he describes it, which some authors are at risk of doing. But this book's reputation has become overshadowed by just this one scene. And there are many people who've said I have no interest in reading the series ever just because of that one part. They'll read A Song of Ice and Fire, they'll read books with many more heavy things in it, but because this book, that is what it is known for, this one thing, it's not even going to be considered something that they want to read. And what's funny is that thematically ties into something that is deeply at the heart of this book. So, that is a long prologue to saying, what is Lord Foul's Bane about? Well, to briefly summarize it, Lord Foul's Bane tells the story of an up-and-coming author living in modern day, well, at the time modern day 1970s America, named Thomas Covenant. He has it all. He has a beautiful wife, a lovely young boy, and he just sold a very successful novel that's selling very well and is working on his second. And while he's working on this second novel, he gets a diagnosis from the doctor that he has contracted leprosy. And there's no cure, it's contagious, and it is going to slowly kill him. There's nothing he can do about it. That's it. You're a leper, you're going to be a pariah for the rest of your life. His wife leaves him, takes his son, he's never going to see them again. The people in the small town near where he lives don't even want him coming into town. They go out of their way to help him. They're like, no. You don't even need to pay the phone bill anymore. We'll take care of that. Don't come into town for your groceries. We'll have them all delivered to you. They basically want nothing to do with him. They want no contact with him, want no communication with him. They don't want this leper around for the health risks, but also in some ways he's just seen as an undesirable now. And obviously, this is very damaging for Thomas Covenant. The opening of the book almost reads like something that you would see out of the book of Job in the Bible, where the man who's wealthy and rich and has everything, and then is caught in the crossfire of this bet between God and the devil as to where his loyalties will lie when he's hit with unimaginable suffering. And so Thomas Covenant experiences a similar thing, and he becomes, as anyone would, bitter, resentful, hateful, and very, very angry. So the book opens with him traveling into town to pay his phone bill, sort of as an act of resistance, an act of defiance, of refusing to let people help him just because they want to avoid being around him. And as he's going into town, he gets hit by a cop car that is swerving quickly around the corner. He gets hit by the cop car, and when he wakes up, he's in a fantasy world. He's not in the real world. And the reason why he's called Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever is, for the majority of this book, he believes that this is not anything real that he's experiencing, that it is either some form of the afterlife, a delusion that he's experiencing, or that he's in some sort of coma from the accident. And Stephen Donaldson plays very fast and loose with the answer that he gives you as far as what is actually going on. So Thomas Covenant is in this fantasy land and is approached by some of the locals there, and is said, because they see that he has lost a couple of fingers from his leprosy, and they see the wedding band that he wears, and they say, you match the exact signs that have been given to us in the prophecies for our legendary, almost King Arthur mythical hero who would return to us someday, called Beric Halfhand. You must be the reincarnation of Beric Halfhand, who's going to save us from their satanic Sauron Dark Lord figure named Lord Foul. So that's why the book is called Lord Foul's Bane. And so the majority of the novel is about Thomas Covenant, who is still dealing with the trauma and anger and bitterness that he has from the rejection that he's experienced over his own leprosy, being called up to be this legendary mythical hero in this fantasy land. So you could almost see it as somebody with the bitterness and twistedness of Gollum being called upon to take on the heroic role of Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. Donaldson gets compared to Tolkien a lot, and in terms of the very superficial, surface-level things, it's not an invalid comparison. You know, both are dealing with very traditional fantasy trappings. You know, you've got knights and kingdoms and dark lords, so there's a lot of those traditional things. Donaldson's writing style is beautiful and poetic, just like Tolkien's is. There is, if you thought there was a lot of walking in The Lord of the Rings, there is even more in Lord Foul's Bane. That is not a negative. That's just to say that if people complain about that in Lord of the Rings, I mean, they ain't seen nothing yet. But in some ways, Donaldson is doing something very, very different in this book than what Tolkien is, where Tolkien has a lot of spiritual depth and allegory and ways that he's trying to reconcile both his own faith and his own sense of mythology and why he's drawn to that, and all of that comes out in this beautiful mythos that he creates through The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. So there's a lot of spiritual ideas that are being explored there and metaphysical ideas. Donaldson seems to be more interested in psychological ideas. I'm not an expert in Carl Jung or Jungian stuff, but I've got the impression from the little bit of looking around that I've done and the little bit I do know that Donaldson is really playing with that a lot in this book. I'm going to reference my notes here, just as we're talking about some other things here. One of the interesting things is that as a leper, Thomas Covenant, all he needs to do to die is to stop checking over his body for the signs of leprosy, for wounds, for scrapes and nicks that he may have gotten throughout the day. All he needs to do is just do nothing, and those wounds, those injuries, his own leprosy, will have him die relatively quickly. And he refuses to. There's a certain act of defiance against the way things have turned out in his life. There's a certain fighting back against the injustice of it, simply in refusing to give up, that Thomas Covenant has. And yet, and then this is, if you want a spoiler warning, I guess this is it, in case you hadn't figured it out, Thomas Covenant is the assaulter that was referenced at the beginning of this video. Our legendary hero who comes into this fantasy land, the magic of the land, when he encounters it, heals him of his wounds. When he gets there, even though he still has the injuries he still has the missing fingers from his leprosy, he is healed. He no longer deals with it. And he craves human connection. He wants to interact with other people. He wants to not be a pariah. He doesn't want to be shunned. And yet, as soon as he encounters these people who are like, you are the prophesied hero, come into our houses, let us feed you, let's take care of you, let's bring you to the Council of Kings, we want to celebrate you. What is the very first thing that he does is to lash out, is to this main girl character, this villager that he's encountered. The first thing that he does is, when he gets a moment alone, when he gets a moment to make a decision for himself, in a sense, the very first moment of agency that he has in the story is he rapes this woman. And once again, Donaldson does it all in very non-voyeuristic language. It's not described in a very overly sexualized way, but he lets you know what happens in terms of the story that he's constructed. Thomas Covenant is bitter and twisted and encounters beauty, and the first reaction that he has is to lash out against it, to attack it, to punch back against the world. Kind of reminds me in some ways of, we talked a couple of months ago about Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, and there's a similar thing there where Jorg, the prince in Prince of Thorns, feels like the world has screwed him over, and so he almost wants to screw the world right back. And there's a similar idea. It's very different, but there's a similar idea in what Stephen Donaldson writes of Thomas Covenant here. That Covenant, out of anger and frustration, as soon as he encounters the very thing he's been looking for and craving for, since he's become a leper, what does he do? He looks to hurt and destroy and wound, instead of accepting it and embracing it. And so what's the contrast here? The interesting thing that Donaldson plays with is that we have this beautiful world. I mean, the world of Thomas Covenant, the world that he's in, is almost saccharine in how sickly sweet and beautiful it is, and the majestic mountains that he encounters. There's a character named Foam Follower, who's a giant, and he's a very noble and heroic character, and he tells Thomas Covenant of the history of the land and the magic from the trees and from the earth, and it is, to a modern reader especially, will come off as very melodramatic almost to a point, with how luscious and overflowing and vibrant this world is, and yet at the heart of it is this twisted, bitter, angry character who can't see past his own problems, who can't see past his own suffering. And he is somebody who's suffered. There is no question about that, and yet he refuses to see past that. There's sequences in the book where Thomas Covenant is traveling from one place to another, and Donaldson will spend time describing the beautiful landscapes and how heroic the people are, like I mentioned, Foam Follower, that he's traveling with, and all of the different history that is in the land that he's traveling through. And all Thomas Covenant can think about is the saddle sores and the pain of the journey and how hot it is now that the sun is out. That's all he can think about. That's all he can focus on. He's a very selfish hero who is in many ways unfit for the selfless task that he's called to go on. And the one act of defiance against the way that the world has done him dirty, at least in his own mind, is to refuse to die, is to keep pushing forward. And so there's a certain nobility to Thomas Covenant simply in that, simply in him refusing to give up, to just lay down and die, which would be so much easier. It would be the end to all of his problems, and he refuses to give up. There's even a portion in the book where he's speaking of Lord Fowl, this Dark Lord, who he encounters pretty early in his time in this fantasy land. And he says that he realizes that Lord Fowl's goal the whole time, because even though he and these other lords are trying to get this plan together to defeat the dark evil forces, he realizes that Lord Fowl is so much more powerful, is so much stronger, that in a sense, He's been playing with them the whole time. And Thomas Covenant says he believes that Lord Foul's goal all the way along has simply been to get them to give up. And so even there, you can see that there's a certain level of playing with psychology there that Donaldson is doing in the text here. The interesting thing is this contrast between Thomas Covenant being able to not see beyond his own pain and not be able to see how vivid and beautiful this fantasy world is that Donaldson then, in a sense, to use a term that Donaldson was famous for, apparently, he reintegrates it into thinking about our world. Because at one point, the giant fun follower says, "Tell me about your world, and what's it like? What was it like there?" And all Thomas Covenant describes to him, and all he can think about, is the murder, and the wars, and the rape, and sickness, and tuberculosis, and that's all he can see. And so a big part of this novel is about Thomas Covenant learning to not be selfish, to realize that in the assault at the beginning of the book, in his own attitude, in his own mindset, that he's being, as the prophesied hero, he's actually working for the Dark Lord. He's actually serving Lord Foul's very purpose. I want to read just one brief thing here where there's a code. I believe they call it the Code of Peace that the other kings and nobles of this land have. And here's what it is. It is, do not hurt when holding is enough. Do not wound where hurting is enough. Do not maim where wounding is enough. And do not kill where maiming is enough. The greatest warrior is one who does not need to kill. And that's the type of nobility that I'm describing here when I say this is a very beautiful land in a lot of ways. So this is a journey where Thomas Covenant needs to, in a sense, reconcile his pain, his trauma, the difficult things he's been through, while at the same time realizing that it's not all about him, and learning self-sacrifice, learning to see a goal and ideals that are higher than him. I found that to be remarkable and heroic. And no, Thomas Covenant isn't likable, but I read Book of the New Sun, so if I needed likable protagonists, then that would be right out the window. I think most people are not going to like reading this simply because they won't be able to get past being inside somebody's head who is angry and bitter and frustrated at the world. But I do think it's an exercise in empathy as well. We all know people who are like that. We've all been that person at one time or another. One of my big misconceptions going into this book is that because of just for the assault and literally no other reason, this book has been described as one of the forefathers of grimdark as a genre. And that one scene aside, that's absolute nonsense. It very much reads as traditional, classical, high fantasy. But the reason why people associate that is because they're unable to look past this one scene of evil that Thomas Covenant commits. And in a similar way, they're committing the same sin, the same error that Thomas Covenant does, which is being unable to look past one dark, awful thing and being unable to see the beauty that's around it. So it's kind of ironic in a sense that they're falling into the same pitfall that Covenant does. There's so many other compelling and beautiful things in the book, but the only thing they can focus on is one 2-paragraph scene in it. And Thomas Covenant made the same mistake as well. So I guess in that sense, he's a very real and human protagonist there as well. So this is not a perfect 10 out of 10 stars. This is not going to be the most entertaining or page-turning book you will ever read. But I do think if you're a fantasy fan, you owe it to yourself to at least try it. I think Stephen Donaldson is engaging with ideas that would later be explored in the grimdark genre while not being in the genre himself. So ideas of how do you reconcile with suffering in the world? How do you make sense of pain around you? How do you integrate that with the beauty that's in the world as well? I've criticized R. Scott Baker recently this year for as much as I enjoy his work as a craftsman, for as talented as I think he is as an author. I think he deliberately chooses to look at nothing other than the most foul and corrupt parts of the world we live in. And I just don't think that's an accurate picture of reality. And in some ways, that's what Donaldson is refuting in this very book. The inability to look past anything other than your own pain and suffering leads to you serving Lord Foul, at least here. So it's almost like, people will say of Dostoevsky that in Crime and Punishment, because he wrote it before Nietzsche was a thinker, that he predicts the philosophy of Nietzsche and also refutes it in the one book before Nietzsche ever came about. And there's honestly a similar thing that's going on here, where Donaldson almost predicts what grimdark is going to explore in a lot of ways, and then refutes a lot of the ideas that grimdark presents before it's even codified as a genre. The last point that I'll make here before I end is that if you're not interested in reading this, but some of the ideas are maybe interesting, the other trilogy that I would recommend, and I actually like quite a bit more than I like Lord Foul's Bane, at least so far, is the trilogy Another Kingdom by Andrew Clavin. So I've mentioned this before in terms of underrated fantasy, but this deals with some similar things. It's about a modern-day Hollywood washed-up writer named Austin Lively, who finds himself transported into a sword and sorcery fantasy land where he's been found with a dead woman in a castle room, and he's holding the bloody dagger that killed her. And guards are breaking down the door to come and arrest him and take him away. And so Austin Lively, while being transported between Galiana and Los Angeles, must discover what is going on and why he's been pulled into this new story and why he's at the very center of it. So I think this explores a lot of the same ideas. Austin Lively, once again, is not the most likable character, but he's certainly not as sinful as Thomas Covenant is. So if you want something that's shorter, moves at a quicker pace, but still explores some of the same ideas, Austin Lively almost works as an opposite to Thomas Covenant in a lot of ways. So if you want something that's similar, plays with similar ideas, but does it a bit differently, Another Kingdom is what I would recommend. So anyway, as of the time of recording this, we haven't had our discussion with Jake and Zach, and I can't wait to see what they think. But hopefully I don't repeat myself too much in between now and that conversation and just rehash the same talking points. But on the whole, I liked this book quite a bit. I was very wrong about it, but because of its reputation, I went into it with some pretty big assumptions. But I think there's value here that often gets overlooked. So I hope you're at least interested in trying it out. So thank you for watching this video, guys. Take care.